Thank you for that kind introduction, and I should say thanks especially to Ron Vinson for not only inviting me here, but for tracking me down on Google, which I gather he did very ably. Let's see. Whoop. There we are. In 16th and 17th century England, the Bible was at the center of national culture. Even today, and probably this won't surprise many of you, the Bible is so regularly and overwhelmingly the best-selling book that it is usually left off the lists kept by Amazon.com and other booksellers. In Shakespeare's day, too, the Bible would have been at the top of the bestseller list if there had been one. The Bible in English was then a relatively new phenomenon, however. There were much earlier translations and paraphrases of portions of the Bible into Old English, and John Wycliffe and his followers translated the Bible into Middle English in the 15th century. This translation was illegal, however, and circulated only secretly, and in any case, the translators worked only from Jerome's Latin translation. Bible translations into English from the original languages of Hebrew and Greek were a product of the Protestant Reformation, which had a late and very shaky arrival in England a generation or so before Shakespeare's birth in 1564. By the time of Shakespeare's childhood, though, English Bibles were everywhere. The most popular translation was the so-called Geneva Bible, first printed in 1560 in Geneva, hence the name, and thereafter in a huge number of different editions and formats, large and small, elaborate and commonplace, costly and cheap, especially cheap. This was one of the reasons for its popularity. It was very easy to get your hands on. The Geneva Bible was translated by English Protestant scholars in exile in Geneva during the reign of Catholic Queen Mary in the 1550s. And the Protestantism it reflected, especially in some of its interpretive marginal notes. It's famous for these, where am I there? There we are. That's a sort of characteristic page of the Geneva Bible, and you can see I've blown up the 23rd Psalm, which you would think wouldn't need all that much commentary, but it's completely swamped. There are thousands and thousands and thousands of these marginal notes, but I think that was actually part of its huge popularity. It was really almost the first kind of English study Bible or Bible for dummies, though it wasn't purchased only by dummies. At any rate, some of these notes reflected the radicalism of the translators, which was a little too radical for the monarchy and the church establishment at the time. Thus, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Matthew Parker, headed up a team that produced a new, more approved translation, though not necessarily improved, in 1568. This is the Bishop's Bible. These Bibles tended to include the images of the reigning monarch simply in order to make sure that they got approval. And so there's Queen Elizabeth very prominently on the title page. This was the version of the Bible that was read in churches in England during most of Shakespeare's lifetime, although the Geneva continued to be the most popular among readers. So he really had two different English versions of the Bible available to him, and it's clear from allusions in his plays that he knew bits and pieces of both. The famous King James Bible was published, as again probably many of you know, only in 1611, too late to have had any real influence on Shakespeare, who retired to Stratford shortly thereafter. In Renaissance England, there was no separation of church and state, and the Queen was the head of both, as in fact she still is. England was a Christian nation, and in theory, the Church of England was synonymous with the national population. Even in practice, this was largely true. A tiny number of Jews lived a clandestine life in London, but Jews had been officially banished from England in 1290 by King Edward I. Catholicism in Shakespeare's lifetime was also illegal. The 1559 Elizabethan Act of Conformity made non-attendance at church, so-called recusancy, a crime, punishable by fine or imprisonment. Enforcement became increasingly strict after the excommunication of Elizabeth by the Pope in 1570, and the failed invasion of England by the Spanish Armada in 1588. Thus, everyone was supposed to be in church, and to an extent difficult for us to imagine today, everyone was. Moreover, since there was only one church, every church in England followed exactly the same liturgy during every service. One result of this was a near universal biblical knowledge, since the reading of the Bible was at the center of the English Protestant worship service. On Sundays and holidays, not to mention baptisms, weddings, and funerals, English men and women listened to readings from the Old and New Testaments, heard the Psalms sung or joined in singing themselves, and followed the sermon, which typically quoted more of the Bible and interpreted it for the congregation. In addition to hearing the Bible in church, anyone who went to grammar school, which Shakespeare did, would learn parts of the Bible in Latin and English as they translated back and forth from one to the other. And if they moved on a little further, they might even do some of the New Testament in Greek. The Bible was part of popular culture as well. There were biblical plays and puppet shows, biblical ballads in wide circulation, and countless books that translated, paraphrased, or commented on the Bible. Bible characters and stories were illustrated in books, but also on wall paintings, fabrics for clothing and furniture, and wood carving and metalwork for weapons, tableware, and other household items. When you went to your local pub, you might find the stories of Susanna and the elders or Daniel in the lion's den decorating the room on painted cloths. When you went to sleep at night, it might be in a bed with Adam and Eve carved on the headboard or stitched into the curtains. None of this necessarily implied any extraordinary piety. It was simply common culture. And here are some examples, relatively random because they were available online. This is a painted cloth featuring the conversion of St. Paul from Hardwick Hall, one of the stately homes. Here's Susanna and the elders, a more modest image on a wall painting on wooden panel. Here is an embroidery featuring the Garden of Eden, sort of stretched out across in different little bits of the narrative. This is an embroidered cushion cover done in the early 17th century of Judith and Holofernes from the Apocrypha. Here are scenes from Esther embroidered on a writing box. This is a bed, obviously. This is nicknamed the Bed of Roses, apparently the marriage bed of King Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, dating from the late 15th century. But this is a close-up from that, and you can see Adam and Eve and the serpent, a very familiar image, but supposedly the faces of Adam and Eve resemble Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. It's not exactly flattering, but it's interesting, and I'm intrigued by this common use of images of Adam and Eve on marriage beds, because, on the one hand, it's traditionally the first marriage, but on the other hand, things don't go exactly well. This is a more curious item. Where would you expect to find Adam and Eve but on a carved powder horn as you go hunting? And so these are all over the place. Here's a stone drinking jug, or stoneware, with scenes Jezebel, Naboth's vineyard, Dives and Lazarus, and Christ healing the bleeding woman. And if anybody can figure out why exactly those four are on a drinking jug, let me know. And here, finally, this was a common gift at baptism or confirmation, an apostle spoon, in this case featuring James the Less, who's supposedly identifiable because he has a, It's a big club for beating wool, which is, I think, was traditionally interpreted allegorically for beating sins out. But there you are. So this is, and these are just a sampling of items of all sorts. So the Bible was really all around. As common culture, the Bible was cited as an authority or point of reference in innumerable contexts: political arguments, moral or legal disputes, personal or social relations, medicine, warfare, literature, child rearing, agriculture. I can tell you, just as one example, every single book on gardening or horticulture in the period begins with Adam and Eve in the garden. And in fact, Bacon's essay on gardens begins by saying, at the beginning, God created a garden. There was no area of life in which the Bible was not felt to be useful. The Bible was also the place to go for help with more personal problems, since it provided exemplary lessons and stories about love, marriage and family, suffering, persecution and death, success and failure, loyalty and betrayal, innocence and guilt, hope and doubt, happiness and sorrow. No surprise, then, that so many writers of the period wove the Bible into their poems, plays, and prose, because, of course, so many of them are concerned with exactly the same problems. Edmund Spenser's massive yet still incomplete Faerie Queene, for instance, proposed to describe the perfect gentleman by a series of allegorical adventures illuminating each of the virtues. The first book focused on holiness, and the Knight of Holiness is St. George, who bears a red cross on his shield. His quest is to help a woman named Una, whose name means one, and who stands for truth, unity, and the truth church, although probably many other things as well. Her parents, we discover, have been besieged in their castle by a dragon horrible and stern. But when we learn that her parents' names are Adam and Eve, we realize that the dragon is actually that old serpent which is the devil and Satan, the great antagonist of the apocalyptic battle described in the book of Revelation. Adam and Eve's imprisonment is an allegorical representation of the sinful state of mankind after their original sin, when Adam and Eve ate the forbidden fruit. God predicts, at least according to the Christian reading, that the sinful state of mankind will only be undone by the sacrifice of Christ, who, according to Revelation, will defeat the serpent in its dragon form. In the Faerie Queene, the dragon fight is the culmination of St. George's long quest, but his first battle is actually with another monster named Error, and you can imagine what that monster might represent. Error. Error from the waist up looks like, and here's the text, Spenser writes in this sort of oldie Englishy, it's kind of like fake Chaucer. Ben Jonson accused Spenser of writing no English, or no language, I think he even went so far as to say. In any case, from the waist up, Error looks like a fair young maiden full of comely glee. But all her hinder parts did plain express a monstrous dragon full of fearful ugliness. In Spenser's Allegory, all of St. George's enemies are on some level one and the same. He keeps fighting the same fight over and over and over again, which is actually Spenser's point, because you can never actually defeat error. It's not possible on this plane. They're all dragons all the way down. But in this case, the biblical text that's key is not actually Revelation, but Genesis. The monster, and here's actually a 19th century illustration of the scene, the monster is a symbolic representation of the very first error, the error that brings error into the world. Eve succumbs to the serpent's temptation, which is why error is half woman, half serpent, as if those two figures in so many illustrations are merged together in Spenser's Allegory. The Faerie Queene is a challenge for any reader, and undergraduates today would certainly confirm this, but without a knowledge of the Bible, it would make hardly any sense at all. Biblical literature was popular in the Renaissance, Reformation, roughly equivalent terms. There were prose and verse paraphrases of the Psalms, the Song of Solomon, and Ecclesiastes, plays about Jonah and David and Bathsheba, and religious poems interwoven with biblical material like the lyrics of John Donne and George Herbert, or Milton's Paradise Lost, Paradise Regained, and Samson Agonistes. Almost everything Milton wrote was steeped in the Bible. And here's a little sort of, this is my little fun pastiche of various biblical items, but it's all over everywhere. And I'm not even including more popular forms like biblical ballads that retell certain stories. And there were, as I said, biblical puppet plays, although sadly, puppet plays are one of the most ephemeral art forms. No texts survive. Though there were some biblical plays staged in Elizabethan and Stuart London, the large majority were not, especially after the 1606 Act to restrain abuses of players, and there were always abuses, so the authorities felt. This act prohibited the use of the name of God, Jesus Christ, the Holy Ghost, or the Trinity on stage, which resulted in some rather bizarre references to classical gods, as in Shakespeare's Measure for Measure, which is set in Catholic Vienna. At one point, Isabella, who's one of our protagonists, attributes the thunder not to God, but to the Roman god Jove, which seems a particularly serious error for a woman who intends to become a nun. But so the law had it. Despite the non-biblical subject matter of Elizabethan and Jacobean drama, though, and the prohibitions against representing or speaking God's name, playwrights were as interested as anyone in religious questions, which concerned, as I said, almost every aspect of life. The Bible was also one of the most reliable components of common culture. Thus, Shakespeare, for example, refers or alludes to the Bible in everything he wrote. Every single work he wrote, including all of his plays, and in fact, he alludes to the Bible more often than to any other book. What this says about his own religious faith is anybody's guess. Countless scholars have been convinced he was either Catholic or Protestant. I don't think I've come across a claim for him being Presbyterian yet, but who knows? But Shakespeare's biblical allusions are not expressions of belief. Often they're expressions of particular characters in specific situations, some of them Catholic, some of them Protestant, some even Jewish. Sometimes, however, it's not clear that the characters are aware of the biblical allusions they're making. This is especially true in pre-Christian plays. I mean, you wouldn't expect Julius Caesar to be making an allusion to the Gospels. That would be strange. In such cases, the purpose of the allusion is to enrich the meaning of the speeches or scenes by adding a sublayer of significance based on biblical texts, characters, or ideas familiar to the audience. One simple yet powerful example is in Shakespeare's Hamlet. When Claudius, trying to persuade, this is the scene here, Claudius trying to persuade his new stepson Hamlet to move on from excessive grief at his father's death, argues that the death of fathers happens to everyone, and Hamlet needs to get over it. Here's what he says. For what we know must be, and is as common as any the most vulgar thing to sense, why should we in our peevish opposition take it to heart? Fie, 'tis a fault to heaven, a fault against the dead, a fault to nature, to reason most absurd, whose common theme is death of fathers, and who still hath cried, from the first corpse till he that died today, this must be so. Though Claudius seems oblivious to it, members of the audience might recall that the first corpse, according to biblical history, belonged to Abel, who was murdered by his brother Cain. And we also remember that Hamlet's brother, well, we don't know this yet, but of course, these days, anybody going to Hamlet already does know this. Hamlet's father is dead because his brother Claudius murdered him. So this subtle allusion to the first corpse, ironic since Claudius is unaware of it, is actually startlingly significant. Moreover, its significance is enhanced later by Hamlet's reference in the graveyard scene, a reference which seems relatively throwaway, but he refers at that point to Cain's jawbone that did the first murder. And so at the beginning and at the end of the play, you have allusions to Cain and Abel, bookending a play about fratricide and revenge. Not all of Shakespeare's allusions to the Bible are serious, though. In the Henry IV plays, for instance, Falstaff, character you may remember, Here he is played by Anthony Quayle, whom I particularly like. This is from the BBC television version of the play. Falstaff alludes to the Bible all the time, but almost always parodically, sometimes actually skating close to blasphemy. When Prince Hal accuses Falstaff of stealing purses, which he does, Falstaff replies that it is his vocation. And as he says, "'Tis no sin for a man to labor in his vocation." In 1 Corinthians, Paul writes, "Let every man abide in the same vocation wherein he was called." And in Ephesians, there again on the screen, he advises, "Walk worthy of the vocation whereunto ye are called." Now, Paul is obviously not thinking of criminals. And a few lines later, in Ephesians, he actually writes, "Let him that stole steal no more," which Shakespeare probably is aware of. But the point, obviously, is comical. Falstaff is a fake in this respect. Later in the play, defending himself against Hal's remarkably imaginative fat jokes, Falstaff pleads, if to be fat be to be hated, then Pharaoh's lean kine are to be loved." This makes absolutely no sense unless you know the dream of Pharaoh in Genesis, interpreted by Joseph, in which 7 years of bountiful harvests, followed by 7 years of famine, are symbolized by 7 thin cattle, or kine, that eat up, very weirdly, 7 fat ones. The fat cattle represent plenty, and the lean ones, dearth. But the only point, as far as I can tell, of Falstaff's cryptic allusion seems to be that fat is good. The bizarre inappropriateness of the allusion, I think, is part of the joke, but Falstaff's distorted biblical allusions are also important in establishing his character as a kind of pseudo-pious hypocrite, or, as has been argued, a kind of mock Puritan. The Merchant of, there's not a particularly accomplished image of the scene, but you've got Pharaoh sort of lying asleep and dreaming in a pretty, you think he could afford a palace better than that, but then you've got this sort of lean and fat kine on either side. Merchant of Venice, as I say, is especially rich in biblical allusions. And the Jewish moneylender Shylock and the Christian merchant Antonio even have a debate. I mean, this is the only debate of its kind, I think, in Tudor Stuart drama. It's a debate about the proper interpretation of a biblical passage, namely Jacob's, and it's another obscure one, Jacob's method of breeding sheep, again in Genesis. If you may remember this story where there's a very testy relationship between Jacob and his father-in-law, who grants him finally leave to go with his 2 wives, Rachel and Leah, and he can take whatever sheep and goats he wants, provided they're striped or streaked or spotted. And so, seemingly inspired by God, Jacob decides to put sort of split pieces of wood in front of the breeding animals. I have no idea how it works. But it does, and it all does well. But I mean, there's a debate about the interpretation of this passage in Shakespeare's play. But Jacob is actually relevant to another scene in which Shylock's servant, Lancelot Gobbo, meets his father, who's come to Venice looking for him. Lancelot indulges in some very broad comedy that seems a bit cruel, especially since it makes fun of his father's blindness. First, he puts on an accent, pretends to be a gentleman, and tells his father, old Gobbo, that his son is dead. His father laments, moaning, and then Lancelot shifts to his own voice, kind of revealing himself, and asks Gobbo if he knows him. Gobbo at this point points out he's blind, which is obvious, to which Lancelot responds, "Nay, indeed, if you had your eyes, you might fail of the knowing me. It is a wise father that knows his own child. Well, old man, I will tell you news of your son. Give me your blessing. Truth will come to light. Murder cannot be hid long. A man's son may, but at the length truth will out." we might already suspect that something is going on here, that this is in fact leading to a farcical parody of the blessing of Jacob by his father Isaac. You may remember this story too, in which Jacob, aided by his mother Rebekah, tricks his brother Esau out of the blessing. The trick depends upon Isaac being blind and Jacob disguising himself as his brother. The biblical background to the scene in Merchant of Venice with the Gobos makes sense of a particularly bit of strange joking when old Gobbo finally comes round to accepting that Lancelot is his son. And here he says, "I'll be sworn, if thou be Lancelot, thou art mine own flesh and blood. Lord worshipped might he be, what a beard hast thou got! Thou hast got more hair on thy chin than Dobbin my fill horse has on his tail." And Lancelot responds to this, "It should seem then that Dobbin's tail grows backward. I am sure he had more hair of his tail than I have of my face when I last saw him." And this is a perfect example of why teaching Shakespeare comedy is awful. It's like explaining jokes at parties. It's just a miserable enterprise. But what's going on here is I think this is, on the one hand, the joke is easier to get in the theater because there's some stage business going on. And we see that I think that old Gobbo is, in fact, rather than feeling the face of his son, he's feeling the back of his head, and so wondering why it's all hairy. But more than this, since Jacob's deception of Isaac also depends upon hair, the scene is developing in that direction. In a famous phrase, when Rebekah suggests her plan to her son, Jacob replies, "Behold, my brother Esau is a rough man, but I am smooth." In this case, the Bishop's Bible translation is a bit clearer. "Esau, my brother, is a hairy man, but I am smooth." So Rebekah ties goatskins to Jacob to fool Isaac, and Isaac is fooled and gives Jacob his blessing, which he seems to be able to do only once, so nothing is left for Esau. And so all of this bit about the hair and the sons and blessings is a complicated comical allusion to Jacob and Isaac and Esau. And I expect you're thinking, this is an awful lot of seemingly irrelevant background for a bit of lame slapstick humor. To which I would agree, except that despite a common misperception, Shakespeare rarely includes scenes of just comic relief. I mean, comedy is a relief in high tragedy or serious plays, but behind the laughter, there's usually something serious to think about. In this case, we need to recognize or realize or remember, if you like, that Jacob and Esau are actually central to Merchant of Venice, since the matter of blessing, or the chosen son, is critical to how Christians thought of their relationship to Judaism. And this relationship is obviously near the heart of the play. What's the relationship between Jews and Christians in Venice or anywhere else? Weirdly, for a culture based on primogeniture, or the inheritance of firstborn sons, and again, this is familiar, I'm sure, to all of you, the genealogy of Israel that God has in his plans usually prefers younger sons over the older brothers. The list of the younger inheritors includes Abel, Jacob, Joseph, Saul, David, Solomon, but most importantly, Isaac himself, Jacob's father and Abraham's second son. Ishmael, Abraham's eldest by his wife's slave Hagar, is promised his own great people, but it's not the people of Israel. In his epistle to the Galatians, Paul explains how it is that God's chosen people is really Christians rather than Jews. And I mean, to say that this is counterintuitive hardly does justice to the intricacy of Paul's argument. And here we go. This is Galatians chapter 4. "For it is written that Abraham had two sons, one by a servant and one by a free woman. But he which was of the servant was born after the flesh, and he which was of the free woman was born by promise. By the which things another thing is meant. For these mothers are the two testaments, the one which is Hagar of Mount Sinai, which gendereth unto bondage. For Hagar or Sinai is a mountain in Arabia, and it answered to Jerusalem, which now is, and she is in bondage with her children. But Jerusalem, which is above, is free, which is the mother of us all. I mean, this ties into the previous talk in terms of Paul's allegorization of Hebrew scripture, but it's something which is key to Merchant of Venice as well. Even though one might think then, reading Genesis, that Isaac and Ishmael represent Jews and Muslims, as in fact Jews and Muslims still believe, Paul tells his readers that since Hagar is in bondage, her son Ishmael obviously represents Jews who are in bondage to the law, while Isaac, the son of Sarah, the free woman, the free wife, obviously represents Christians. Therefore, brethren, he concludes, we are after the manner of Isaac, children of the promise. We might be reminded of this when Shylock asks about his servant Lancelot, what says that fool of Hagar's offspring? The line goes by quickly, but Shylock's reference to Hagar is not just a casual insult, but a reassertion of Judaism's claim to descent from Isaac, rejecting Paul's exegetical maneuver and representing Christians as the children of bondage, rather, which in fact, and let me sort of pause just to kind of make sure all of this is sorted, Shylock is accusing Lancelot of being one of Hagar's offspring. Therefore, Lancelot is one of the descendants of Ishmael, a child of bondage, which is exactly the opposite of what Paul claimed. But of course, Shylock is Jewish and claims himself descent from Isaac, the son of Sarah. In addition to the sort of Jewish-Christian business here, it's also, I think, relevant that Lancelot is not just Shylock's servant, but seemingly an indentured servant, which is actually a kind of bondage. So he is literally in bondage, as well as by implication in spiritual bondage, at least from Shylock's perspective. So what seems like a sort of lighthearted slapstick scene, and it is, and can be, perfectly satisfactory, although a lot of it doesn't make much sense, if you press it, if you think about it, there's actually quite a lot that comes out. Allusion works in many different ways, and sometimes the effect depends upon mistakes or misquotation. A particularly interesting case is Bottom's speech from Midsummer Night's Dream, after he wakes up from spending the night with the Queen of the Fairies, and you probably know this from countless high school plays, having a donkey's head. And here's his, there he is, in a wonderful 19th century painting. But here's this speech. I have had a most rare vision. I have had a dream, past the wit of man to say what dream it was. Man is but an ass if he go about to expound this dream. Methought I was, there is no man can tell what. Methought I was, and methought I had, but man is but a patched fool if he will offer to say what methought I had. The eye of man hath not heard, the ear of man hath not seen, man's hand is not able to taste, his tongue to conceive, nor his heart to report what my dream was. I will get Peter Quince to write a ballad of this dream. It shall be called Bottom's Dream, because it hath no bottom. And I will sing it at the latter end of a play before the Duke. Peradventure, to make it the more gracious, I shall sing it at her death. So, I mean, it's a great speech. Bottom's a great character, and there's a good laugh in all of that sort of sensory scramble with eyes hearing and ears seeing. But these lines are actually borrowed, presumably entirely without Bottom's awareness, from St. Paul's first epistle to the Corinthians. But we speak the wisdom of God in a mystery, even the hid wisdom, which God had determined before the world unto our glory, which none of the princes of this world hath known, for had they known it, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. But as it is written, the things which eye hath not seen, neither ear hath heard, neither came into any man's heart, are which God hath prepared for them that love him. But God hath revealed them unto us by his Spirit. For the Spirit searcheth all things, yea, the deep things of God. For what man knoweth the things of a man, save the spirit of a man which is in him? Even so, the things of God knoweth no man, but the Spirit of God. What is Shakespeare up to here? Presumably, he's not implying that Bottom's experience was actually divine. And Bottom's comical verbal confusion supports this. At the same time, I think he may be using Paul's language, and he's assuming, I think in this case, he's not just lifting from Paul, he's, I think, assuming that at least some members of his audience recognize Paul behind Bottom's speech and recognizing that Bottom is mangling it up. But I think part of what's going on here is that Shakespeare is trying to convey a sense that what we've experienced along with Bottom is a genuine mystery of a different kind. One that is theatrical, even if not religious. And I'm inclined to go even a little further and suggest that Bottom's experience, on some level, somehow, might be even more mysterious than the one Paul describes, since after all, we can at least comprehend that there are things which our eyes have not seen or our ears heard, but something which is beyond our ears seeing or our eyes hearing is entirely beyond us. And I find some support for this interpretation in another translation of 1 Corinthians. This is why it's interesting sometimes to bounce around between the different versions that Shakespeare had available. The one I quoted just now is from the Geneva Bible, which seems the one most familiar to Shakespeare and which presumably he had on his desk. But a translation somewhat earlier in the 16th century, this was by Miles Coverdale. It's the so-called Great Bible, which was authorized by Henry VIII. If you look down at the bottom of the quotation, which is verse 10, you read instead of the previous one has, even so the things of God knoweth no man but the Spirit of God. Or it's actually, no, sorry, I cut that a little bit off. It's the deep things. The Spirit searcheth all things, yea, the deep things of God. But in this earlier version, the Spirit searcheth all things, yea, the bottom of God's secrets, which I find interesting. I suppose we might read this just as another joke at Bottom's expense, but I wonder. In the same epistle, Paul also writes about the peculiar Christian understanding of wisdom and foolishness, stating that the wisdom of the world is foolishness with God, and declaring, we are fools for Christ's sake, but ye are wise in Christ. The patched fool was one of the standard character actors in Elizabethan theater companies, and Bottom was probably played by Will Kemp, the most celebrated comic actor of his day. Like all of Shakespeare's fools, Bottom is often wise, as in his response to being doted on by the Queen of the Fairies. Here's another image of that scene. This is from the Max Reinhardt film early in the 20th century. Titania, under the flower's spell, exclaims, thy fair virtue's force perforce doth move me on the first view to say, to swear I love thee. To which Bottom replies, methinks, mistress, you should have little reason for that. And yet, he goes on, to say the truth, reason and love keep little company together nowadays. This is perhaps the smartest thing said in the play about love. And it's actually interesting to remember that of all the characters in the play, Bottom is the only one whose mind remains unchanged. He's physically transformed, but he is himself, as opposed to all of the Athenian lovers who have, in fact, their brains scrambled one way or another. So his perceptions are what they were. In my study of Shakespeare's use of the Bible, I was not just interested in identifying and explaining his biblical allusions, but in situating them within a cultural context that might suggest how his audience could have interpreted them. After all, the Bible has always been an interpreted Bible, as the scholar James Kugel put it. For all that Protestants like Luther and Tyndale preach sola scriptura, as well as the ability of individual Christians to read and understand the Bible on their own, there was a vast number of sermons, commentaries, guides, and annotations published and purchased after the Reformation, which suggests that at least some readers needed a little bit of help. In the case of Bottom's Dream and its allusions, there was an extremely popular 16th century book that not only explored the idea of being a fool for Christ, but quoted the exact same passage from 1 Corinthians about God's mysteries. In Praise of Folly by Desiderius Erasmus was written in Latin in 1511 and translated into English in 1549, with further editions in 1557 and 1577. The work begins, it's a whole sort of comical, farcical allegory, and narrated by the character Folly herself, personified as a woman, and initially she praises things that are totally nonsensical, like self-praise, madness, foolishness of all kinds, including abuses by the Catholic Church. But the satire takes a strange turn when Folly addresses Christian foolishness in Paul's sense. We realize at this point that Erasmus's praise of certain kinds of folly may be serious after all. Folly speaks of holy men who are utterly transformed by the might of God, the greatest good of all, that ravisheth and attireth all things to itself. And she concludes, so much, lo, are spiritual things to be preferred before fleshly things, and the invisible before the other visible. For this undoubtedly is even the very guerdon, or reward, that the prophet promiseth, saying, was never man's eye saw, nor ear heard, nor thought of heart yet compassed, what and how great felicity God hath prepared unto such as do love him. I can't prove that Shakespeare read Erasmus's Praise of Folly or had it in mind when writing Midsummer Night's Dream, but I suspect he did. And certainly some of his audience would have known the work. Even if they hadn't, it provides further support for the idea that Paul's passages on God's mysteries in 1 Corinthians was often associated with wise fools, specifically those wise in Christ, as Paul describes it. And this makes me confident that Bottom exhibits a similar kind of foolish wisdom, that he's not just to be written off as a comic idiot. I'm not claiming, again, that Bottom's vision is in any way Christian or that A Midsummer Night's Dream is a Christian play, just that Shakespeare's allusion to Christian mysteries conveys to his audience a sense that there's more to this scene than slapstick farce. The play's mysteries are theatrical, but they're mysteries nevertheless. After all, and here I'm hearkening back to the beginning of the scope of this conference, well, actually even before, the heightened experiences that art and religion perhaps share have been intertwined since the prehistoric cave paintings of our ancestors and their Neanderthal cousins. Who's to say whether the paintings in the caves in Lascaux are religious or artistic or both, and how that works? My reluctance to describe Shakespeare's personal faith does not imply, I should clarify, that I don't think he had any, or that I think his faith was necessarily irrelevant to what he wrote. We simply lack conclusive external evidence for his beliefs. And the internal evidence, which is all we have, which is the content of his poems and plays, is even less conclusive. We do know that he was baptized and married in the parish church in Stratford, where he, his wife, and children are buried, and his brother Edmund is buried in Southwark Cathedral in London, seemingly and probably likely at Shakespeare's own expense. This suggests conformity to the Church of England, even if perhaps he did not subscribe to each of its 39 articles. We just don't know. Shakespeare does, however, demonstrate a thorough and deeply thoughtful knowledge of the Bible, which must be the product of private reading as well as attendance at church. Yet the evidence for this claim, the thousands of biblical allusions in his writing, reveal his knowledge and perhaps his interest, but not necessarily his beliefs. If I had time, I could go through more of these. I could talk about allusions to Adam and Eve and the Garden of Eden in Hamlet, to Judas, Pilate, and the crucified Christ in Macbeth, to the book of Revelation in Antony and Cleopatra, the book of Job in King Lear, or to the Virgin Mary and the Song of Solomon in Romeo and Juliet. The Bible was the matrix, the womb out of which post-Reformation English culture was born, shaping almost every aspect of intellectual and practical life, binding English men and women together through a shared biblical literacy for which there simply is no modern equivalent. Whether that's a matter of collapse or decay, I don't know, but I think one would be hard-pressed to find any area of popular culture today that has remotely the same near-universal scope. The culture was so pervasively biblical, however, and so pervasively religious that the modern distinction between sacred and secular really doesn't even apply. There is no such thing as secular in the 16th century in the modern sense. Our challenge today, of course, is to try to relearn the biblical literacy Shakespeare took for granted and without which so much of the meaning of his plays is diminished. Thank you.